Welcome everybody to Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center's second webinar of the 2023. Today's presenter is Mitch Lench from Ocean's Balance, a seaweed farm here in Maine. And Mitch is going to be telling us about some of his recent it was one visit, right, Mitch, to Norway, to talk with some companies in Norway about some of the innovations that they have, and to look into translating those back to Maine. So, is there anything you'd like to add, Mitch?
No, thank you, Annie. I think that's good, and we can start maybe the slide presentation, and I can give you kind of a little background. I'll start. I'm Mitch Lench, again, CEO of Ocean's Balance, and I'll go through a little bit about what Ocean's Balance does in a moment. But what I'm going to talk about, is really my trip to Norway that took place in the first week of December. Next slide, please. So I think, the first thing to maybe discuss is why Norway. There's a lot of places around the world where there's really interesting things going on in seaweed farming and processing, and some places have a lot longer history. Norway attracted me for a couple of reasons. One, they have a lot of interesting kind of aquaculture technology, which was built up with all of the salmon farming that they've done. Also, there's a pretty close relationship between Maine and some of the Scandinavian countries, including Norway. And then the other thing is Catapult, which is, I'll talk about in a moment. They're based in Norway, in Oslo, and they're an accelerator, an investor. So we had a number of connection points because they're an investor, a recent investor in Ocean's Balance. And kind of my impressions of Norway, just maybe to start it off, it's beautiful, as you would imagine, and some of you I'm sure have been there, and it resembles Maine in certain ways. But one of the things that hit me in beginning of December is how much colder and how short the days are. Basically, the light was light from about 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. and I've never been in an environment where it got dark so early. But given their vast oil wealth, I think they have the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. Things just work really well there. Everything's in really great shape. So just from an aesthetic perspective, it was quite a nice country to visit. The coastline is 100,000 kilometers long. Just to give you kind of an idea of the vastness of Norway. That's about 18 times the size of the Maine coastline when you include all of our islands. And with a population of just 5 million people, it really is a fairly sparsely populated country. Even Oslo is a relatively small city compared to most European places, European capitals. So next slide, please. So, the farmer to farmer exchange program was great. I mean, I visited several seaweed companies, as well as the trip took some different twists and turns along the way, where I added visits that I wasn't expecting to do after speaking to locals about who else would be interesting to meet up with, including the marine science laboratory called SINTEF, and a very large food manufacturer called Orkla, which I kept on hearing about Orkla. And I said, all right, I gotta meet these people and find out what they're doing in the whole seaweed industry. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So the companies I visited were Seaweed Solutions, Arctic Seaweed, Soft Seaweed. There was actually another company that's related to soft seaweed, which I'll touch on in a moment, and then SINTEF being the marine science laboratory. And by the way, if you have any questions as you go along, just I think put them into the chat if you want, and then I think someone will probably interrupt me because I may not be paying attention to the chat about your question. So next slide, please. So the first thing I thought I would just mention, because I mentioned it earlier, is the Catapult connection. And the Catapult is a venture fund and accelerator, and they happen to be in Norway. And they're considered to be kind of the leading ocean accelerator program in the world. So they're focused on investing in companies that will have a positive impact on the ocean as well as climate change. They have two cohorts they take in each year, and they provide seed fund and have companies go through, an accelerator program. For those who aren't familiar, that's a program that helps early stage companies help you prepare for growth and thinking. They want you to think big. They want you to think about your next 5 steps, investors, how you're going to market and scale up. Very focused on impact. We went through a whole big impact series on, how do you really measure impact? It's kind of a really interesting program to go through. And this accelerator too had 3 unicorns in their short history. Unicorns being companies that ended up with over $1 billion valuation, which is pretty amazing for the early stage that they tend to invest in. And what attracted us about Catapult is they were the initial investors in some companies that in the seaweed space that we really respect, and that includes Ocean Rainforest out of the Faroe Islands, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, Oceania, and several other seaweed companies, including a couple of West Coast seaweed companies. 12 Tides went through their program I think in 2021. And then they have a follow-on fund that invests in future rounds of companies in the same companies. So part of the benefit of being in one of these accelerator programs is the connections they provide. So they make all different types of introductions, and they were the ones who helped me set up most of the meetings I had in Norway with other seaweed companies, because even if they hadn't invested in all the companies, it's a small population, and they're extremely focused on seaweed, so they know they know all these folks. They talk regularly. Next slide, please. So I thought before I went into the Norwegian meetings, I would give you a quick overview of what Ocean Balance does. So we're a vertically integrated seaweed company. Our primary facility is in Biddeford. We also do some processing at another facility. We're pretty focused on technology, and we have a hatchery that we got some grant funding from NOAA recently, and a partnership with Woods Hole on, where we're kind of moving towards gametophyte culture, and we have a number of things going on there. And then we have our own farm, as well as we work with third-party farmers who we provide seed and technical expertise to help them ramp up. And we also, I think we're one of the only companies that does farming, as well as we do sustainable wild harvest of some species that are yet farmable, such as dulse. And we're working on trying to bring more species in to be able to be farmed. And that's a big goal of ours to move in that direction. And then on the processing side, I'll mention something on one of the unique processing capabilities that we've built out recently. We then formulate and create products for both the consumer products market. So we sell our products in about 1,400 stores across the U.S., including chains like Whole Foods and Hannaford's, as well as we sell ingredients that go to food manufacturers, pet food companies, cosmetic companies, etc. And almost all of our products are manufactured at our own facility. And there's a lot of synergies between what we're doing on both the consumer side and the industrial side. So anyway, next slide, please. If you can hear me, just flip to the next slide, please. Okay, next slide again. That's just a picture of our boat. Here's just some of our retail products. Give you an idea. We have a number of seasonings and pasta sauces, etc. Next slide. All right, so I'm gonna first company I met with and I'll talk about is Arctic Seaweed, which is pretty advanced technologically advanced seaweed farming company. I met with the guy Matthias Boing, who I met in Oslo. The CEO and founders is named Kim, and he was in a far off location, which would have taken me like a full day to get to. And there wasn't really much to see at this time in terms of going out on the water. So I met with his colleague, Matthias, who also happened to have worked at Catapult. So he was in the alumni network there. So they're doing about, I think they do harvest about 200,000 pounds per day, which is pretty like huge compared to, I think, what anyone's doing in Maine. And they're really focusing on using less surface of the ocean and introducing a lot of technology to do that. Their goal is to do 8 million tons of wet seaweed by 2030, which is an unbelievable goal. They have several different farm locations, and they're really focused on what they would call precision cultivation. So they have lines that move up and down and at different depths, depending on what species, what part of the season they're growing in. Different species, I guess, require different depths, and they've been testing this out over a number of years to kind of refine and use an iterative process to find the right levels. And one thing that I thought was really cool about what they have is a harvester and seeding boat that they outfit each season. I think they rent the boat, but then they put on all this equipment that enables them to do huge amounts of harvesting or seeding in just one day. And they actually not only do it for themselves, but they travel to Greenland as well, where they help a company over there do the same. So they provide the harvesting and seeding for them. And yeah, I think what they also do is like they can adjust to certain sea conditions. Like if there's certain temperatures, light levels that are changing, they can adjust what's going on in the ocean. The other thing that I thought was interesting is their processing, how they do their processing, which is very different than I think what anyone is doing in Maine or in the US. So they limit the exposure to air of the seaweed to 30 minutes to preserve freshness and quality. And I'm not exactly sure, what happens, how our feeling always was like you had, at least 24 hours to process, but perhaps they know something we don't know. And then they put most of their seaweed into some kind of stabilizing processing solution, which they do out on the boat. And the bulk of their seaweed is sold to a company called Orkla, which is a large conglomerate food company, which I'll talk about in a second, that is, I guess, our equivalent to something like Kraft Heinz in the US. They have a bunch of different portfolio companies within the brand of Orkla. And I kept on coming up against Orkla, like hearing Orkla. It was same with Seaweed Solutions, another company. So they don't do a lot of the processing themselves at these big farming companies in Norway. Most of that seems to be done by third parties. So you'll hear me mention, I think I'll mention at the end a little bit too, that what I found really interesting is there's heavy focus on hatcheries, on farming, a little less so themselves on being vertically integrated on the processing side. About Orkla, so I pivoted while I was on this trip. When I kept hearing Orkla, I said, I want to meet Orkla and just find out what they're doing, because maybe it's I get some examples that we can use in the US if they're, Orkla may be further ahead on some of the introducing seaweed into everyday food in the Nordic region. And I think Orkla is the largest food manufacturing company in that part of the world. They have 20,000 employees, 12 different portfolio companies under their brand, similar to like a Kraft Heinz, very focused on sustainability. And they created a team. I think it's a team I met. I met a number of them in person, and the head of the team video conferenced in. I think it was a team of about 5 people. And the team is just focused on how to get seaweed into a multitude of products in their different verticals of food companies. So what I thought was a couple of interesting takeaways is that they focus a lot on ingredients and using it, and they don't even always mention it as being added into the food. It's something like, it's not something that they necessarily are always advertising. It may be something that is just quietly done because it has different health benefits. So instead of like, I think what most of us are doing right now is, leading with the seaweed when we're marketing new products, they're kind of letting that kind of take the back seat. And I think part of that is maybe not everybody is ready for seaweed in their food, and yet it has different functional benefits that are helpful. Another thing mentioned is they actually made an investment into Arctic, that the seaweed farming company. But they also purchased from Seaweed Solutions, and I'm not sure if they purchased from any other companies in Norway. And they really focus on saying, like, we're playing the long game. They're still trying to figure out this market, just as we are trying to figure it out. It's not like there's a roadmap that's very clear, but they're trying different things, and I think they're going through a lot of seaweed. So one way or another, they're figuring out how to introduce it into a whole number of products. I think I don't know how secretive they are about what they're doing with it, but in some ways it would be great to have Orkla talk to other companies in the US, some other big food manufacturers where they may be more advanced than some others in how they're introducing it. And one of the challenges they talked about, which is, a challenge here as well, is the price. They're looking to get down to per, say, pound of, I would say probably dried. I don't know if I don't have it in my notes what they were specifying. I think it was dried pounds. They're looking to get down to like a $4.50 per pound level, which we're very far off in Norway, but as well as in Maine from getting their on farm kelp. So that's, a big part of our, what I think everybody is focusing on. How do we bring the price down to widen out the market to make it be able to compete with other, maybe some less expensive species of wild seaweed, as well as other ingredients. Next slide, please. This is a next company I went to is called Seaweed Solutions. And first, before I went out to Seaweed Solutions in Trondheim, which is beautiful, small city on the ocean, I first met with the CEO. His name is John Funderud, and he's a scientist by training, and you can tell like what Seaweed Solutions has done is very like science driven. It's interesting. It's not as much commercial driven. They've been around, I think, since 2009, when they first started farming seaweed. And their vision from the beginning was to enable like large scale ocean farming. Actually, I don't know if you can play that video. It's a 2-minute video that just kind of goes through their background a little bit, which I thought may be interesting to show.
Please give me just a moment to get the audio correct.
Sure.
Or I screen share.
Okay.
maybe this is an opportunity to ask the audience if there are any questions that they would like to ask Mitch. If you have some questions, please use the Q&A function, which you should find at the bottom of your screen.
And maybe why, oh, there we go. Well, I can continue talking a little bit about seaweed solutions while we get the video going. So these, I mean, so they're fully integrated. Oh, there we go. With their seed and whenever you're ready to just start it, I'll just stop.
Surrounded by the sea. For centuries, this has been our way of life. The conditions here are rough.
We don't seem to have audio yet.
You had audio for a second, but that's okay. We can, I didn't. There we go.
But along the Norwegian coast, off the island of Frøya, lies hidden opportunities. Our seaweed grows through the cold winter in pristine subarctic waters. It only needs sunlight and seawater to grow, making the cultivation clean and responsible. By controlling the whole value chain, from seed to processed seaweed, we ensure the highest quality product. Our seaweed adds salty and umami flavor to a variety of dishes, from plant-based burgers to salads and snacks. In addition to food, we are always researching new ways to utilize this resource. Already, seaweed can be used for numerous applications, including animal feed, fertilizer, and bioplastics. Welcome to a new era. An era where we play by nature's rules. We believe seaweed is the biomass of the future. An eco-friendly crop with a variety of uses. For the ocean, for the planet, for the future.
Okay, yeah, I mean, so part of the reason I thought about showing it is just I went there when I was there. It was snowing. It wasn't great for picture taking and the rest. So just to give you an idea of the vastness in that area, what I ended up spending most of my time doing there is going through their hatchery, which was incredibly impressive. And there's what you find is they're working on several different, I guess, experiments and projects at the same time. You have everything from traditional seed, direct seeding, these incredibly long seeding lines. I've never seen anything like it. These like spools that are like, 20 times bigger than anything I've seen before. And they're measuring, and they've done this over enough years that they have really gotten, I think they're starting to really figure out what works where. So it was the scale of the hatchery was really impressive. Like in terms of one of these like biochambers, environmental chambers, they had a whole room that was basically a biochamber. And that was like all red lights, and they're continually, doing experiments and multiple species as well that they're working with. So very impressed with the way they've developed, and they brought on recently, I just met him. He's kind of like had just started a new CEO. And I think that he came from Atlantic Sapphire And I think their goal was to kind of really start pushing them more into the commercial side, because they're very scientist heavy as a group, which I think has been great for getting them to this, ability to really scale up farming. And now they need to figure out how do they commercialize some of that, that scalability. And the other thing that's interesting is that they're in the same city or town as Syntef, which on the fly, I got a meeting with them. It was a fairly short meeting because I had to catch a flight, but Syntef is a marine science, or it's a science laboratory, and they have a marine science part to it. I met with a couple of people, a woman named Yorin Skjermo, who's a senior scientist, very experienced in seaweed cultivation, and then her colleague, also very experienced, Ole Jacob Broek. Very close relationships with Seaweed Solutions and some of the other companies. So a lot of the hatchery work, farming work has been done in conjunction with the science lab. They also, Syntef has another unit that's focused on more processing and advanced processing, and they have projects going on with bioplastics and animal additives, and list goes on. I think there's some connectivity with U.S. institutions, science institutions with them as well on certain projects. I think I think Nicole from Bigelow is doing some work with them, and maybe some others. And one of the things that it kept coming up against too is they have a lot of EU funds and a lot of Norwegian funds, but EU funds. So some of the projects they're able to do are pretty large at scale. Next slide, please.
Hey, Mitch, we have a quick question.
Sure.
How long is their growing season there?
Good question. I think it's fairly similar to ours. I think, and when they put in, I don't know, I think they may have a longer ability to keep the crop in longer than we do, but I don't know exactly the end date when they tend to take out. But it's not like, I know in the Faroe Islands, and maybe it's different depending on which part of Norway. I know like ocean rainforest, they have multiple harvests that go on. And I think I may be recollecting this correctly or not, I don't know. I think they're also looking at that maybe on certain farms, like the more than one harvest in a season, in a year. So the other company I met with is called Soft Seaweed, and there's an entrepreneur called Morten Crosslet, who seems to be a serial entrepreneur, really nice guy. Also happens to be a Catapult alumni, went through their program. And he's also an owner of another company, engineering company called Serpudis, which is, I think they were at Seagriculture in Portland last in September. And Serpudis is different. They're focused on like non-standard equipment for the, as they say, for the blue economy. And I'll talk about them in a moment. But Soft Seaweed is really focused on high-tech applications to the seaweed industry. So AI solutions for seaweed farmers, and the data, which you kind of track on a smartphone, is aggregated to help everybody improve certain certain information that is helping the whole market. They also have, you can, next slide, please. They also, here's just some of the challenge. I just put in a few of their slides because I remember he had sent me their slide deck, so I added a few things. Next slide. So here's just the app and what some of the things it does. A lot of what they're doing too, and you can go on the next slide. They do sensors as well that are attached to the application on your smartphone, and they have monitoring buoys that are doing water measurements meteorological measurements. And I think the idea is to save on the amount of time you have to check your lines and to also figure out optimal locations to put your farms. Next slide, please. And and I know there's a couple companies working on the apps and so forth for seaweed farmers. We haven't actually invested in any of those yet, and we haven't really done a full analysis on like how does it compare to some of the other companies that are doing something similar. So this company, also owned by Morton, is Serputis, which they're based in Lithuania, but Morton, I think, goes back and forth from Norway. And they have a lot of engineering talent on their team, and they're developing all different types of technology for the seaweed industry. And part of the reason I think they're in Lithuania is because they're eligible for large EU grants. I remember I lived in Europe for 7 years, and I remember a lot of EU funds go to the lesser economically developed countries within the EU. And I think Lithuania falls there. So they also have a lot of quantitative folks in Lithuania. So they have a whole team that they specialize in equipment for seaweed cultivation, harvesting, and processing. They actually, I think, built the harvest boat for Arctic that I mentioned before that does automatic cutting and pulling. And they have different washing machines for seaweed. They also do, they have a lot of different processing equipment, everything from cutters and blanchers, dryers, bag sealers. I didn't get to visit Lithuania on this trip, but I went through that with Morton. They also do a lot on the seeding of ropes and spooling machines. So I don't know, like if you're looking for some specialized equipment, they probably would be good folks to talk to. So some of the takeaways, I guess, from the trip, and looking at it from a Maine perspective too, is I think Norway they have certain comparative advantages over Maine from a farming and scalability perspective. You have their regulatory approval process seems very efficient for seaweed farming. I don't think the time takes that long to actually put in large farms, and they don't have a big NIMBY issue that we're starting to have in Maine, and maybe that's partly because their coastline is so big, and they're also doing some of their farming further offshore. That being said, I think in certain ways we may be ahead of Norway in terms of some of the product innovation that's going on here. And they still have some big challenges to open up markets for all of that seaweed that they're growing. So I think they're probably needing to maybe shift a little bit to be more vertically integrated on the product and distribution side. And while they, have that, I guess, the ability to really scale up farming on a way that probably would not be possible to that length in Maine. The other kind of takeaway is just the level of grant funding and government support in Europe that you see. And I think it's not only Norway, it's other countries too, but it just far exceeds what we have in the US. And probably because there's such a large amount of grant funding, and a lot of those opportunities in Europe seem to be with multiple companies and science institutions. There seems to be a more collaborative environment, which I think is healthy, especially at this early stage of the market. And I think there's definitely areas where companies don't want to share, but there's probably a lot of areas where it would serve the industry well, including individual companies better if there was more sharing, more openness, more kind of like not everyone has to do every single thing in the value chain in order to still have proprietary things for your own company. So I was just thinking about it, like what areas can we collaborate better as an industry in Maine and surrounding areas. And I think some of it is on the grant funding area where I think there's certain grants and things from an industry that we could really all benefit from. Some of it maybe marketing, maybe certain equipment that can help a number of different companies. And I think, just a lot of sharing amongst the farming community. And I'm not saying that they're doing that so well there. I don't really know if they are or not. But it's definitely not a zero-sum game, I think, in terms of sharing that information. And Green Wave is doing a lot of great things to make this happen. And I think some other organizations are trying to work on this as well. But I think a lot, like through trial and error, and from a hatchery perspective to a farming perspective, that's how most people, I think, come up the learning curve, and more areas where we can share that would be great. One last thing I'll just mention on the last slide, which is unrelated necessarily to Norway, but it does relate to kind of like sharing and figuring out ways we can collaborate. So some of you may know we recently had a large-scale farm kelp dryer built overseas that actually was just tested a couple of weeks ago with similar seaweed to what we're growing here. And it worked really well. It can do 30,000 pounds of wet seaweed per day. We use low heat to preserve the nutrients. Product looked great when it came out. We did test it with fairly large amounts of seaweed to really give it a full testing. And we also have milling machines at our facility where we're going to have the dryer. The dryer will arrive in beginning of April. We'll do some testing. So by probably the third week of April, it'll be up and running, and we can turn, things into powders, flakes, and granules. And the reason I'm mentioning it partly is we're opening it up to the market to use, because it's a lot more capacity than we possibly could use. And so other farmers in the market, competitors, doesn't matter if you're, another vertically integrated company or whatever. We spent a lot of money on this piece of equipment, partly because we had no drying option in our region, and it was a big bottleneck for us, and we know it's been for the industry. So we're, just looking, we're not looking to charge exorbitant fees to make this a big profit center. We just want to charge reasonable fees for the service of drying. It could be, individual farmers or companies. And we hope in the future, like other equipment that's needed for the industry, maybe we share on like harvesting equipment across Maine, or seeding equipment that would work for multiple farms. We hope that like we can kind of do that as an industry, because I think we're all pretty small companies, even though we kind of, some of us think we're bigger than we are, we're small. And so there's no need to kind of reinvent the wheel and spend more money than we need to until we kind of get the industry up and going. So I thought I would just kind of close on that note and open it up to any questions you may have.
All right,
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. You go ahead. I was just going to say thank you very much, Mitch. We actually do have a few questions in the chat for you, and I'm going to let Emily go take it away with those.
Okay, the first one is, were there surprises or misconceptions that you had working with international partners on this project?
I think I was surprised mainly by the scale and somewhat sophistication, or and some of that is tied together of what I saw when in terms of that market. And I thought, there's a lot of sophisticated things going on in the US as well. I think, the Mariner program and some of the funding that has gone to really help scale up some of the farming, especially out in Alaska with some of the harvest boats and seeding is pretty interesting. But yeah, they've been doing it for a number of years. So it's really the scale that was pretty impressive.
All right, we have a few questions about funding. So how does their funding process differ from Maine in terms of grants and loans and things?
Yeah, I think in Norway specifically, there's both Norwegian funds that are available for this area. And Norway, as I mentioned, to start with, is one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest country in the world on a per capita basis because of their oil money. I mean, they have other things going for them too, but that oil money is, I mean, they are a huge donor because when I used to do work over in Europe, they have Norfund, they have different pockets of money that go to focus on helping development and sustainability issues. So they have a lot of money in Norway, and then the EU funds the projects that you see going on there. I think there's some on biorefinery side, a number of large projects. These are not like 2 million, 3 million. These are like 12 million, $20 million grants that are given. And generally it's collaborative projects. I know Ocean Rainforest is involved in a few, and I think a number of these companies are. So I just think there's just a lot more cash available. And we, as a state, I guess for those who are from Maine, you know, Alaska is a good roadmap of some things that maybe we can do in terms of getting certain types of funding. And I know people are working on that too, but there's funds out there. There's just probably not as much as you would find in the EU.
Yeah, that's actually the second part of the question is about if you can think of any funding or regulation changes that would help support Maine's kelp industry.
Yeah, I'm blanking on the name, and probably Chris or Annie know of the funding, like what they received recently in Alaska. It's like these, I think it was like a $40 or $50 million.
Build Back Better.
Yeah. Okay. Build Back Better. So if we could put something together like that for Maine, that would be fantastic. I think one of the biggest challenges I'm finding in Maine is our bottleneck on the regulatory side. And I think it's a lot about I think there's two issues going on with, it's at the DMR level. I think it's that they've been short on resources. I think they hired some people recently. And then I think also we're lumped in to the entire aquaculture industry, which may or may not be fair, depending on what perspective you're looking at it from. But my view is that if you look at it on a dollar basis, seaweed is still a very small part of overall aquaculture. But if you look at it on a potential market and where we can get to if we don't let everyone eat our lunch, that's a different way of looking at it. And I think that's what we need to shift some of the policymakers in Maine's perspective on, is that it's not just historical, it's about the future. Obviously, cook aquaculture is a much larger player. Salmon farms are currently, you know, the size of these salmon farms are huge. And you know, then you have the right whale issue that takes up a lot of DMR resources. So I think we just need allocation, and it would be great if we got certain resources at the DMR level that was focused on seaweed. That's, you know, maybe my own tunnel vision perspective, but that's what I'm thinking.
All right, the next question is about controlling heavy metals in your farm.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer for how you control heavy metals other than where you maybe put your farm. I think in the farm seaweed, the one advantage, I guess, over wild from just a crop perspective is you're probably going to have less heavy metals because it spends less time in the water compared to farmed. So that may be an issue. We haven't had big challenges on heavy metal, but not to say that there aren't, and we can. We know we can. I think some, you know, blanching will get rid of some of your heavy metals. It'll also get rid of a lot of your nutrients. It maybe brings down the iodine level. So there's, you know, you're washing out a lot of the goodness in the seaweed when you're doing that, but it also will take out some of the toxins, if there are toxins, you know, at a higher level in your seaweed.
Great. We have a couple more. What parameters do you measure when evaluating the quality of the finished product? Like a couple examples, or protein, fats.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's a good question. I'm not the expert within our team at doing that in terms of like the testing, but It is, I mean, it is the certain nutrients that we are looking for right now. What you find is that there's not enough probably focus by the consumer or companies yet on the difference between some of the different qualities in seaweed. I think that's going to come over time. So like what I think most buyers don't really realize is that depending on the time you harvest your seaweed, that's going to have a huge impact on your nutrient, maybe much more than anything else. And we're kind of challenged in that respect in Maine, in that we can pretty much only harvest for at this point at a couple months out of the year if we want to get, you know, some biomass. But I don't have a great answer on the specific, you know, things that we're, you know, going to be most focused on.
All right, we have one more question. On average, how long does it take to get a permit for seaweed farm in Norway?
Oh, I think it's well within a year time, and these are, you know, large farms, and I think probably from what I heard a little bit, it depends on where you put your farm too. Just like in Maine, certain areas are going to be more challenging if you're near the coast. They do have some NIMBYism, they told me. It's not like it doesn't exist there, but a lot of their farms are further up north where there's less densely populated areas, and also further offshore. So I don't think, like, you know, one of the challenges in Maine is just going through the hearing process and getting all the different constituents together who may have an issue where what they don't have a big issue on is other fishermen, lobstermen, or, you know, who are challenging those permits as much as we have in Maine, probably.
Thank you very much. Those were some great questions, and thank you for your answers, Mitch. They were much appreciated.
Yeah.
And I would just like to say to everyone that this is a webinar program that is hosted by the Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center with support from the Media Services Department at the University of Maine. We have partners such as Mitch who are joining us every month on the third Friday of every month to between 12 noon and 1 p.m. Next month in April is also going to be a seaweed focused webinar, and that will be presented by Peter Rahn and Casey Balin from Atlantic Sea Farms. And the people that you see here on screen are the MAIC team. There's myself, Anne Langston-Knoll, Chris Davis, the Executive Director of the Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center, Emily Whitmore, who's our resident social scientist, Maya Pelletier, who will be starting with us in May, and Sydney Avina, who's working on sea scallops. And you can also have heard from Mitch Lench, who is our presenter this month. I think there's one more question. Is that right, Maya? Go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly ask, first, thank you. But I was also wondering, when you were talking about the Orkla organization, you mentioned that they are working on using seaweed as an additive more than advertising specifically based off of the seaweed content. And I was wondering, first, if this is impacting the price that they're getting on the seaweed, and second, if it's a market that the US or Maine would be competitive in if it is impacting the price that they're getting.
Yeah. So I don't know exactly like all their pricing on the seaweed and how that's translating. They were a little secretive and not, you know, exposing all of the details. One of the things that they do, and I don't, you know, someone who's probably more on the advanced like processing or maybe fermentation side, this solution that they're taking the seaweed in at, that I think saves a lot of money for them. And I don't know if that solution has any other effects that are not good from, you know, a health perspective, but I think that's how they're processing a lot rather than drying. They do dry. They also have some drying capabilities, and I know they are doing drying, but they're also doing that, and that may be a cheaper way to get it into the food. And it's also, when you think about it, seaweed with its water weight, maybe 10x on sugar kelp it's also a cheaper way if you're adding it as an ingredient because you're selling the water as well as the seaweed. So maybe that's how they're getting the price point down. So yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question? I also wanted to thank MAIC for sponsoring this trip, which was great. And I wouldn't have gone all and done this part of my travels without probably that type of funding. So really appreciate it. And I'm, glad to share whatever I learned with whoever wants to know. So feel free to reach out directly if you have any, further questions.
Watch our Facebook page and certainly email circulation list in Maine for the registration link to register for that. And thank you everyone for attending. Please just, if the attendees, if you could just sign out, and we look forward to seeing you next month.